3 days after my brother's wedding, I watched the hotel lobby footage from a conference room beside my attorney. Mallory stood next to a luggage cart with her wedding dress sealed inside a clear garment bag, one hand gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Across the lobby, Nathan leaned over the front desk and asked the clerk to cancel the airport car, remove his card from any future charges, and separate his room from hers. The clerk turned to Mallory and asked for another form of payment. Her phone kept vibrating in her hand, but the footage had no sound, and I could not see the messages. I only knew that 3 days earlier, my brother had watched strangers empty my purse in front of a ballroom full of people. By that afternoon, he could no longer look at his bride. Before I tell you how a missing bracelet destroyed a marriage in less than a week, I hope you are doing well, and I hope you will stay with me until the truth comes out. If you enjoy stories about families, betrayal, and consequences, please subscribe to the channel and keep listening. On Saturday night, Mallory was still the perfect bride. Her smile was soft, her voice was warm, and every person in that hotel seemed ready to believe whatever she said. I was the only one who noticed how quickly that warmth vanished when she thought I had recognized something she wanted buried. I had gone upstairs to the bridal suite because my mother had left a pearl hairpin in her room and asked me to deliver it. Mallory was standing in front of the mirror, while 2 bridesmaids adjusted the back of her dress. My red purse sat on a chair near the vanity. I opened the inside zipper, took out 2 headache tablets, and swallowed them with water. When I looked up, Mallory was watching my hands in the mirror. She smiled as soon as our eyes met, but the smile arrived a second too late. Mallory lifted her wrist and asked me to help with the clasp. The bracelet was beautiful without being flashy. Small diamonds sat in an old gold setting, and the clasp had been shaped like a tulip. One link near the hinge was a slightly different shade, as if it had been replaced years after the rest of the piece was made. The clasp resisted when I pressed it. Something about the shape, the repair, and the weight of the bracelet pulled at an old memory I could not quite reach, so I told her it looked familiar, and mentioned a missing property report with a similar floral clasp. Mallory pulled her wrist away so sharply that the repaired link scraped my thumbnail. Then she laughed and rubbed the mark as if I had imagined the movement. It belonged to my grandmother. Old jewelry always looks familiar, doesn't it? One bridesmaid complimented the bracelet, and Mallory turned toward her with the same warm smile she used for everyone else. I told myself I was letting my job follow me into a wedding. I had made that mistake with Nathan before, and he had never let me forget it. Downstairs, I left my purse at the coat check counter because the family table was crowded. 3 black equipment cases belonging to the photography team sat against the wall beside it, each marked with white tape and a printed inventory number. A small security camera faced the hallway, but I barely noticed it. At the time, the cases were only cases, and the camera was only part of the hotel. Later, those ordinary things would speak more clearly than anyone in my family had. My mother, Linda, waved me over before I reached the ballroom. She handed me a seating card and asked me to fix a mistake at my aunt's table. 5 minutes later, she wanted me to check whether the cake vendor had received the final payment. Mallory crossed the room while I was handling both problems and touched my mother's arm with practiced affection. "Dana means well," she told one of Nathan's coworkers. "She just has a hard time trusting people." It sounded like a defense, but it was a label placed carefully enough that every question I asked afterward would look like suspicion, jealousy, or control. Nathan found me near the family table and lowered his voice. "Please don't turn tonight into another background check. Just let me have one day where you're my sister, not an investigator." I told him I had come because he was my brother. He said he was glad, but his eyes were already moving across the ballroom toward Mallory. "Then let it be enough," he said, and walked away before I could answer. For almost an hour, I tried. I sat through dinner, smiled for family photographs, and listened while Mallory's friends described her as the most generous person they knew. Then, just before the first toast, a sharp cry cut through the ballroom. Mallory stood near the dance floor with one hand wrapped around her bare wrist. "My bracelet," she said. "It's gone." The music stopped, people turned in their chairs, and Mallory looked around as though the answer had already formed in her mind before her eyes landed on me. Dana was the last person who touched it, she said. She was alone in the bridal suite. I reminded her that her bridesmaids had been there, but she claimed I had stayed after they left. That was false. Yet the accusation moved faster than the correction. Mallory asked hotel security to come over. Several guests lifted their phones, and Nathan stepped beside her instead of beside me. He told everyone to calm down, without once telling Mallory she was wrong. I looked at the security manager and said that if Mallory believed I had committed a crime, they should call the police. Mallory's face changed for half a second, then she nodded and told them to do it. A patrol officer arrived while the ballroom whispered around us. Mallory gave him her identification and signed a statement saying she believed I had taken the bracelet. She described it as an heirloom from her grandmother and said I had resented her relationship with Nathan. I listened without interrupting, then agreed to let the female hotel manager inspect my purse, but only with the officer present, 2 witnesses, and a written incident report. They brought my purse from coat check and placed a white service cloth on a side table. I removed my coat and stood where everyone could see my hands. The manager opened the purse and set out my wallet, keys, headache tablets, business cards, Nathan's wedding envelope, and an old photograph of Nathan and me standing beside our father before he died. My brother stared at the photograph for a moment, then looked away. "Just let them check," he said. "We need to get this over with." The manager opened the inside zipper, found only a folded receipt, and checked every pocket twice. The bracelet was not there. I asked Mallory whether she wanted to withdraw her accusation. She pressed a hand to her chest and said, "I must have passed the bracelet to someone." That was the moment I understood the search had never been designed to clear me. There was no result Mallory would accept except my guilt. I asked the officer to record that nothing had been found and that Mallory continued accusing me after the inspection. Then I faced Nathan and told him he had watched them empty my purse and seen them find nothing. What happened next was his choice, not mine. His face tightened before he asked me to leave, just for the night, so they could sort everything out later. I picked up my belongings one by one and placed them back inside the purse. I did not beg him to reconsider, and I did not apologize for embarrassing the woman who had just accused me of a crime. I walked toward coat check while the music slowly started again behind me, quieter than before. As I waited for my coat, I heard Mallory speaking to the officer near the ballroom doors. Nathan was still beside her, and the small microphone clipped beneath his lapel was still recording for the wedding video. "Check the inside zipper of the red purse first," she said. My hand stopped on the purse strap. No one had mentioned the zipper before the search, and no one, except Mallory, had watched me open it upstairs. I still did not know where the bracelet was, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Mallory had not simply accused me in a moment of panic. She had expected that bracelet to be inside my purse. By the time I reached my apartment, the reception would have been moving into speeches and dancing. My phone showed 8 missed calls from my mother, 2 from Nathan, and more notifications than I wanted to open. I turned the device face down, placed my red purse on the dining table, and removed everything exactly as the hotel manager had done. Wallet, keys, medication, business cards, wedding envelope, the photograph of Nathan and me with our father. I wrote the time beside each event while the details were still sharp. When I entered the bridal suite, when I touched Mallory's bracelet, when I checked my purse at the counter, when she accused me, and when the officer recorded that the search had found nothing. At work, I had learned that memory became less useful every time someone repeated a cleaner version of what had happened. Mallory already had a ballroom full of people helping her do that. I opened the first wedding photographs that had been posted online. Most showed Mallory smiling beneath strings of warm lights, her hand raised so the bracelet caught the camera flash. I enlarged one, until the image blurred. The floral clasp was barely visible, but the shape stirred the same discomfort I had felt upstairs. I could not remember the resident's name or the exact report, only a description buried in years of compliance files. Floral clasp. Replacement link. Missing jewelry. I wrote those words beneath my timeline, then stopped. I no longer worked for the company that had owned Silver Glen, and I had no legal right to enter its system merely because something felt familiar. If the memory mattered, I would have to recover it without crossing the line I expected everyone else to respect. My mother called again. This time I answered. Linda did not ask whether I was safe, or how it had felt to have strangers examine my belongings. She told me Mallory had spent the rest of the reception crying in a private room, and that Nathan had barely spoken during the cake cutting. "You need to apologize," she said. When I asked what I had done, she sighed as if I were intentionally making the conversation difficult. She said I had embarrassed Mallory by demanding a police report, turning a family misunderstanding into an official incident, and leaving before the toast. I reminded her that Mallory had accused me of stealing an $18,000 bracelet. My mother replied that no one knew the value yet, and that I always made everything sound like a legal case. I asked whether she believed I had taken it. She said that was not the point. I told her it was the only point that mattered, and that she could call me again when she was ready to say plainly that my purse had been searched and the bracelet had not been inside it. Nathan called 20 minutes later. His voice sounded exhausted, but exhaustion was not an apology. He said Mallory had been under enormous pressure and might have misunderstood something she saw in the bridal suite. I asked whether she had misunderstood signing a statement that named me as the thief. He said I was twisting his words. Then he asked me not to contact the hotel, the photographer, or the police again because the wedding had already become a disaster. "Let us handle this privately," he said. I asked him once more whether he believed I had stolen the bracelet. He was silent long enough to answer me without speaking, then finally said he did not know what to believe. I told him that from that point forward, any communication about the accusation needed to be in writing. He called that cold. I called it necessary, and ended the call before he could ask me to protect him from the consequences of what he had allowed. The first video appeared online before midnight. It had been filmed from behind the family table and ended while the hotel manager was still removing items from my purse. The person who posted it had added the caption, "When the groom's jealous sister gets caught ruining the wedding." The clip never showed the empty zipper, the completed search, or Mallory continuing to accuse me afterward. By morning, strangers had decided I was bitter, controlling, and probably guilty. Someone found the public page for my employer and tagged it beneath the video. I typed a response explaining what had actually happened, read it twice, and deleted it. Anything written in anger would become another exhibit Mallory could use to prove I was obsessed with her. Instead, I emailed our general counsel and compliance officer before they heard about the video from someone else. I explained that I had been publicly accused of theft at a family event, that a police statement and hotel incident report existed, and that the accusation might become connected to a former workplace matter. I confirmed that I had not accessed any restricted databases or used company resources to investigate. They thanked me for disclosing the conflict and asked me to preserve all communications. The review made me uncomfortable, but it also protected me. I could not accuse Mallory of exploiting systems while quietly using one for myself. That afternoon, I met Elise Grant, an attorney whose practice included elder law and civil litigation. She listened without interrupting while I walked her through the timeline and showed her the incomplete video. When I told her about the hallway camera, she explained that requesting footage did not mean the hotel had to hand it directly to me. It meant placing the venue, its insurer, the photographer, and the videographer on notice that the material could become evidence and must not be erased or altered. We sent preservation letters that same day, identifying the police report number, the coat check hallway, the bridal suite corridor, and the period beginning 30 minutes before Mallory claimed the bracelet was missing. Elise also requested the photographer's equipment logs and the wedding videographer's audio files. She did not promise that any of it would clear me. She only said we were making sure the truth still existed when someone finally decided to look for it. The next morning, Elise called while I was driving to work and told me to pull over. During an inventory of the photography equipment, an assistant named Reese Parker had found a white handkerchief stuffed inside the side pocket of a hard case. The bracelet was wrapped inside it. Reese had not removed it and carried it around. She had called her supervisor and the hotel manager, photographed where it was found, and waited while the case was logged and transferred to the officer connected to Mallory's report. The equipment case had been placed beside coat check before the reception and locked after the team packed for the night. Mallory responded by suggesting Reese might have stolen the bracelet and hidden it after realizing the police were involved. Nathan sent me a message 10 minutes later. He wrote that the bracelet had been found, but that did not prove who had placed it in the case. He asked me not to treat this as a victory. I stared at those words until the traffic light changed twice. I had not been looking for victory. I had been looking for the minimum acknowledgement that I had not taken anything. Even with the bracelet recovered from someone else's equipment, my brother was still protecting the possibility of my guilt because accepting the alternative would force him to look at the woman he had married. Near the end of the day, Elise forwarded an email from the hotel's attorney. The venue had begun reviewing the preserved footage with its insurer and the investigating officer. One camera covered the hallway between the bridal suite and coat check. The preliminary review showed Mallory leaving the suite with the bracelet still on her wrist. Several minutes later, before she ever announced it was missing, the same camera appeared to show her stop beneath a wall sconce, look in both directions, and remove it herself. The hotel did not send me the footage. Elise and I watched it 2 days later in a conference room at the venue's law firm, with the investigating officer, the hotel's attorney, Nathan, Mallory, and representatives for the photography company present. No one sat beside me. Nathan took the chair closest to Mallory, though he kept both hands folded on the table and never touched her. The hotel's attorney reminded everyone that the video remained evidence and could not be copied or distributed without approval. Then he dimmed the lights and started the recording from the hallway outside the bridal suite. The first clip showed Mallory leaving the suite with the bracelet still on her wrist. She stopped to pose for photographs, spoke to 2 bridesmaids, and walked toward the ballroom. There was no sign that the clasp had failed or that the bracelet had slipped off. Several minutes later, another camera captured her returning alone. She stood beneath a wall sconce, looked toward the elevator, then toward the ballroom doors, and removed the bracelet with both hands. The movement was careful, not frantic. She folded it into a white handkerchief and headed directly toward coat check. The next angle showed my red purse on the counter beside the photography cases. Mallory slowed as she approached it. Before she could reach the counter, one of the bridesmaids picked up my purse and carried it toward the ballroom because I had asked for my headache medication. Mallory stopped so abruptly that the hem of her dress swung forward. A hotel employee entered the hall from the service corridor. Mallory turned away from the purse, bent beside the nearest equipment case, and pushed the folded handkerchief into its side pocket. She remained there only a few seconds before returning to the reception. No one spoke when the video ended. Mallory stared at the blank screen, then said the bracelet had been hurting her wrist. She claimed she had removed it because the clasp felt loose and hidden it temporarily because she saw me near coat check and feared I might take it. The officer asked why. If she knew she had placed the bracelet in the case, she later signed a statement accusing me of stealing it. Mallory's eyes filled with tears. She said she had been overwhelmed and no longer remembered where she had put it. She insisted that when she saw the purse, she suddenly became afraid of me. I asked why she had told the officer to search the inside zipper. Her attorney objected to the tone of my question, but the officer asked it again in his own words. Mallory said she must have remembered seeing me open the purse upstairs. That answer would have explained how she knew the zipper existed. It did not explain why she had directed the search there as though she expected the bracelet to be found. The wedding videographer then played an audio file from the microphone clipped beneath Nathan's lapel. The sound was imperfect, filled with music and conversation, but Mallory's voice was clear because she had been standing beside him. The timestamp placed the exchange several minutes before my purse was brought to the side table. Mallory said, "Check the inside zipper of the red purse first. She hides things there." I had never hidden anything there, and Mallory had known me for less than 2 years. She had seen me retrieve medication from that pocket once. She had turned that single detail into a prepared accusation. Nathan looked at me for the first time since the meeting began. His face had lost all color. Mallory reached for his arm, but he pulled it away and asked whether she had planned to put the bracelet in my purse. She denied it immediately. She said she had only wanted to protect the bracelet from me, then admitted she had not believed I would really steal it, then said she had believed it in the moment. Each version contradicted the one before it. The officer stopped asking questions and wrote in his notebook, while her attorney leaned close and told her not to say anything else. The footage alone would have been enough to destroy Mallory's story inside that room, but it did not become public because the hotel suddenly decided to humiliate a bride. Mallory made that decision for them. Before the meeting was over, someone managing her social media posted a statement claiming the photography assistant had taken the bracelet and hidden it inside the equipment case. The post described Reese as an irresponsible contractor trying to shift blame onto a grieving bride. By then, the first cropped video of my purse being searched had already spread far beyond our family. Mallory was trying to replace one suspect with another before anyone outside the room saw the truth. The photography company's attorney demanded a public retraction. Nathan had signed the event contract, and the hotel's insurer would not release security footage without consent and legal review. After seeing what Mallory had done, Nathan authorized the hotel's counsel to provide a short, redacted excerpt to the photography company for the limited purpose of answering the public accusation. Faces of unrelated guests were blurred. The excerpt showed Mallory removing the bracelet, approaching my purse, and hiding the handkerchief in the case. It did not include private hotel areas or the rest of the wedding. Reese posted the approved excerpt beside the original clip of my purse being searched. Her caption was simple. She had not stolen the bracelet, the equipment inventory proved where it had been found, and the footage showed who had put it there. Within hours, the two videos were being shared together. People who had called me jealous began deleting their comments. Others slowed the hallway footage frame by frame, pointing out Mallory's glance toward the camera, the purse being moved, and the way she changed direction. The story was no longer about whether I looked calm enough while being accused. It was about why a bride had tried to manufacture evidence against her husband's sister. I did not celebrate. I watched the video once to confirm that the public excerpt matched what I had seen, then closed the app. Being proven innocent did not erase the image of Nathan asking me to leave after the search found nothing. It did not return the wedding night, or make my mother's demand for an apology disappear. The truth had arrived, but it had not repaired anything. It had only removed the excuse everyone had been using to avoid choosing a side. Nathan called me repeatedly that afternoon. I let the first 4 calls go unanswered. When I finally picked up, he told me he had canceled the airport car and the honeymoon flights. He had asked the hotel to separate their charges and had moved out of the suite. His voice sounded hollow, as if he expected me to tell him what to do next. I asked whether he had withdrawn the statement he had given the officer suggesting I might have taken the bracelet. He said he was working on it. I told him to call me after he had corrected the record, not before. I learned the rest through documents, not imagination. The cancellation email showed the airport transfer had been stopped. The hotel invoice showed Nathan's card removed from future charges. The lobby camera, which I saw later through Elise, showed Mallory standing beside the luggage cart while the front desk asked her for her own payment method. Nathan later confirmed in a sworn statement that he had ended the trip after watching the footage and hearing the audio. I did not know what they said to each other in their room, and I never pretended I did. I only knew that Mallory checked out alone before sunset with her wedding dress hanging from the side of the cart. That evening, my inbox filled with apologies from people who had believed the cropped video. Most were more interested in distancing themselves from Mallory than acknowledging what they had done to me. I answered none of them. Near midnight, a message arrived from a woman named Colleen Price. It included a photograph of an elderly woman seated beside a Christmas tree, one hand resting on the arm of a chair. Around her wrist was the same diamond bracelet Mallory had worn at the wedding. Even in the older photograph, I could see the tulip-shaped clasp and the slightly darker replacement link. Colleen wrote that the woman was her mother, Helen. She said the bracelet had disappeared from Silver Glen Assisted Living 5 years earlier, along with other personal items that staff had dismissed as confusion. She had recognized it not from the grainy hallway footage, but from one of the professional wedding photographs being shared beside the video. Then she sent a second image, a close-up of the repair receipt, with the words, "floral clasp," and "replacement gold link," typed beneath the jeweler's stamp. I read the name Helen Price twice before the memory returned. It was not a face I remembered first. It was a line from a report I had signed in 2020. Diamond bracelet, floral clasp, 1 replacement link. The report had ended with the words, "Responsibility could not be determined." 5 years later, the missing bracelet had appeared on my brother's bride, and the woman wearing it had tried to frame me before I could remember where I had seen it described. Colleen refused to send the rest of her documents by email. She said too many people had already treated her mother's belongings as evidence before remembering they had belonged to a person. Elise arranged for us to meet 2 days later in a private conference room at her office. When I arrived, Colleen was seated beside a battered blue document box, with both hands resting on the lid. She was in her late 50s, with silver beginning at her temples, and an expression that made it clear she had not come to comfort me. Before she opened the box, she asked me to explain exactly what role I had played at Silver Glen in 2020. She did not want a title. She wanted to know what I had seen, what I had decided, and why my name appeared on the report her family had received. I told her I had been a regional compliance analyst for the company that owned Silver Glen. I reviewed complaints, staff schedules, corrective actions, and whether facilities followed reporting requirements. Most of my work began from an office 40 minutes away, not inside the residence rooms. By the time I visited Silver Glen in person, Mallory had already resigned. I had never interviewed her face-to-face. I had seen a grainy employee badge photograph, a personnel file, and a written statement signed Mallory Keene. I admitted that I had signed the final corrective action report after management told me the external complaint had already been reviewed and closed for lack of direct evidence. Colleen listened without interrupting, then asked whether I had believed the matter was truly resolved. I could have hidden behind technical language, but I had used enough of that 5 years earlier. I told her I had believed the facility had completed the required steps. I had not believed the families had received the whole truth. Only then did Colleen open the box. She removed photographs one at a time and arranged them across the table. Helen wore the bracelet at birthdays, church luncheons, a retirement dinner, and a Christmas gathering nearly 15 years before Silver Glen. In every photograph, the tulip clasp sat just above the inside of her wrist. Colleen placed the original purchase receipt beside them, followed by a jeweler's repair slip from 2012. The repair description listed 1 replacement gold link near the clasp because the original had cracked. The jeweler had noted that the new link would remain slightly darker unless the family paid to refinish the entire bracelet. Helen had refused because, according to Colleen, she liked being able to see where it had been repaired. The police still held the bracelet from the wedding, so none of us touched it. Elise had already sent the officer copies of Colleen's documents and proof that Colleen represented Helen's estate. The officer later confirmed a small engraving inside the clasp. HP. Mallory had never mentioned those initials when she called the bracelet her grandmother's. Colleen showed me the report she had filed after the bracelet disappeared from Helen's room at Silver Glen. The description matched the object in police custody almost word for word. Diamond bracelet, floral clasp, 1 replacement gold link, initials HP on the interior. The estimated value at the time had been $18,000. My mother didn't forget giving it away, Colleen said. She asked about it every week until she stopped asking about most things. Her voice remained steady, but she pressed one thumb into the edge of the repair receipt. Silver Glen had repeatedly suggested that Helen might have hidden the bracelet, misplaced it during a hospital visit, or given it to someone and forgotten. Colleen had searched drawers, laundry bags, medication carts, and every box in her mother's former house. When no one found it, the facility reimbursed part of the value and told her the internal review had revealed no responsible employee. That settlement had never felt like an answer. It had felt like payment for silence. The name Mallory Keene appeared in the staff roster attached to the old file. She had been 28 and worked as a personal care aide, a role that allowed her to help residents dress, bathe, eat, and move between rooms. She had access to jewelry boxes, bedside tables, handbags, and the private routines of people whose memories were easy to challenge. Her employee photograph was poorly lit and several years younger than the woman Nathan married. In the photograph, she had dark brown hair cut at her chin, no professional makeup, and the exhausted expression of someone photographed halfway through a long shift. By the wedding, her hair was lighter and longer, her clothes more polished, and her surname Reed. Public records later confirmed that she had legally adopted her stepfather's surname after leaving Silver Glen. That difference explained why I had not recognized her. It did not explain why she had failed to recognize me. My name had been printed on the compliance report that followed her resignation. Nathan had told her what I did for a living long before the wedding. Mallory had known exactly who his sister was, while I was still trying to remember why her bracelet looked familiar. The imbalance settled over me slowly. She had entered our family with 5 years to prepare an explanation if I ever connected her to Silver Glen. I had entered the bridal suite believing the worst thing between us was that she found me controlling. The old external report made the situation worse. Silver Glen had technically reported one missing property complaint to the appropriate state channel, but Janice Bell had described it as a single unverified loss. She had not supplemented the report when other families complained about missing cash, gift cards, and jewelry. She had not included the emerging pattern around certain shifts. The outside file had been closed because there was no camera footage, recovered property, confession, or witness who had seen anyone take the bracelet. When I conducted the regional review months later, company counsel told me the mandated report had already been handled. Janice gave me a corrective action plan involving new inventory procedures, locked storage, and family sign-out forms. I had questioned why so many reports clustered within the same period. I had recommended a wider review of staffing patterns and stronger escalation to the corporate board. Janice argued that the incidents involved residents with memory difficulties, visiting relatives, housekeeping staff, and unsecured personal property. Nothing, she said, connected them to one employee. Mallory had resigned before my visit, and legal counsel warned against naming a former worker without direct proof. I accepted the corrective action report because every required box appeared to have been checked. I did not falsify evidence, suppress an external report, or know that Janice had withheld additional complaint logs. But I had understood that the official conclusion protected the facility more effectively than it protected the residents, and I had signed anyway. Nathan came to Elisa's office the following evening after I sent him copies of the photographs and receipts through counsel. He looked as though he had not slept. He did not defend what Mallory had done at the wedding, but he separated that lie from everything at Silver Glen. He said a changed surname was not proof of theft. A former employee owning a similar bracelet was suspicious, but similarity was not certainty. Mallory could have bought it from a resale shop or received it from someone connected to Helen. He also pointed out that one merchant record or one missing bracelet would not prove she had taken every item reported at the facility. For once, I agreed with him without qualification. We had not proved every loss, and I would not turn a pattern into a conviction simply because Mallory had tried to frame me. I told him the bracelet could be identified by the engraving, repair record, photographs, and police inspection. I told him the rest would require independent documents and witnesses. Then I said he was free to ask hard questions, but he was not free to ask me to stop, because the answers might make his marriage harder to understand. Nathan looked at the photographs for a long time before asking whether I had known about Mallory when I investigated her background. I told him no. I had found gaps and inconsistent job descriptions, but not the name Keene. If I had known, I would not have walked into that bridal suite unprepared. After Nathan left, Colleen removed one final document from the blue box. It was the family copy of Silver Glen's corrective action report. I recognized the formatting before I saw the last page. The conclusion stated that responsibility for Helen's missing bracelet could not be determined, that required reporting procedures had been followed, and that the facility had implemented safeguards to prevent future losses. Beneath those sentences was my name, my title, and my signature in black ink. I had spent 3 days proving Mallory had manufactured a lie against me. Sitting there with Colleen's copy of the report in front of me, I understood that the next truth would be more difficult. Mallory had stolen a bracelet and tried to make me look guilty. 5 years earlier, my signature had helped the institution around her declare that no one could be held responsible. Once Colleen agreed to let Elise use copies of her mother's records, the old Silver Glen case stopped looking like a single missing bracelet. It became a timeline. I spread the documents across Elise's conference table and marked every complaint by date, room number, staff assignment, and type of loss. Cash disappeared from a bedside envelope. 2 gift cards vanished from a locked drawer that had not actually been locked. A resident's credit card was used for a small online purchase. A gold ring went missing after a shower. Each incident had been treated as a separate problem involving a different family, a different room, and a resident whose memory could be questioned. When I placed the shift schedules beside them, the pattern I had sensed 5 years earlier became difficult to ignore. Mallory had not been the only employee present, but she had access to nearly every affected resident within hours of the reported losses. I was careful not to call that proof. Patterns could show where to look, but they could not tell me who had opened a drawer or typed a card number into a website. That distinction mattered because Silver Glen had once blurred it in the opposite direction. When management needed a person to calm an angry family, they had chosen Rosa Alvarez, a housekeeping employee whose name appeared near one of the missing property reports. Rosa had cleaned Helen's floor and several rooms connected to other complaints. She also had less institutional power than the nurses, aides, and managers around her. The file said a resident's ring disappeared after Rosa changed the bed linens. Mallory had submitted a statement saying she had seen Rosa's cart outside the room and believed the resident had worn the ring that morning. Mallory did not claim she saw Rosa take anything. She only added enough suggestion to turn proximity into suspicion. Janice suspended Rosa, pending review, then ended her employment after the family threatened to contact the press. The ring was never found in Rosa's locker, car, home, or belongings. No witness saw her with it. The facility called the termination a risk management decision rather than a finding of theft. I remembered arguing that absence of proof could not become proof simply because management needed a conclusion. Janice had responded that residents and families needed to feel safe, and that Rosa's continued presence would damage trust. At the time, I documented my objection and moved on to the broader corrective action review. I told myself I had done what my role allowed. Sitting across from Colleen 5 years later, I understood how small that objection must have looked to the woman who lost her job. Elise located Rosa through a former employment attorney. Rosa did not agree to speak with us immediately. She asked for the police report number, Elise's bar information, and written confirmation that no one from Silver Glen would be present. When she finally joined us by video, she wore a grocery store uniform and sat at a kitchen table with a stack of unopened mail beside her. She did not recognize me until I gave my former title. Then, her expression changed. "You signed the report," she said. I told her I had, and I did not try to soften it by saying I had objected to her termination. An objection that remained buried in an internal file had not restored her income or reputation. Rosa said Silver Glen's decision followed her for years. Another care facility withdrew a job offer after checking her employment history. Her marriage had already been strained, and losing steady work made it worse. She eventually left healthcare entirely. Rosa remembered Mallory clearly. Mallory had been helpful in public and cutting in private, especially with residents whose families complained. According to Rosa, Mallory often said elderly residents gave things away and forgot. If cash disappeared, she suggested a visiting relative had taken it. If jewelry vanished, She wondered aloud whether housekeeping had moved it. She rarely accused anyone directly. She supplied a possibility and allowed someone with more authority to turn it into an action. Rosa also remembered Helen asking about the bracelet. Mallory had told staff that Helen might have given it to someone during a confused moment. When Rosa asked why no one searched staff lockers or reviewed access to Helen's room, Mallory warned her not to make herself look defensive. 2 weeks later, Rosa became the focus of the missing ring complaint. "I didn't take that ring," she said. "But once they decided I was the kind of person who could, nothing I said mattered." I apologized for failing to push harder when her case crossed my desk. Rosa did not tell me it was all right. She said she would decide whether to give a formal statement after speaking with her own attorney. I thanked her and accepted the boundary. She had already spent 5 years being told what other people needed from her. The external reporting record confirmed another problem. Janice had reported Helen's bracelet as one unverified loss, satisfying the facility's immediate reporting obligation on paper. She had not submitted supplemental information when the other complaints accumulated. She had not included the shift overlap, Mallory's inconsistent statements, or Rosa's unsupported suspension. Her position had been that the incidents were too different to combine. One involved cash, another jewelry, another, an online transaction. Some residents had dementia. Family members came and went. Rooms were not always secured. By separating every event, Janice made sure no individual report became strong enough to expose the pattern. I had seen enough of that pattern in 2020 to recommend a wider review. Corporate counsel told me the outside matter had already been closed and warned against accusing a former employee without direct evidence. Janice presented new storage rules, property inventories, family sign-out sheets, and staff training. Every corrective step looked reasonable. I signed the report because the facility had technically responded to the complaint before it. I did not know Janice had withheld additional logs from the external reviewer, but I knew the conclusion felt too clean for the facts underneath it. When Colleen asked why I had not escalated beyond Janice and corporate counsel, I gave her the answer I had avoided giving myself. I was 33, newly promoted, and determined to prove I could distinguish professional judgment from emotion. The lawyers told me there was no recoverable property, no witness, no confession, and no lawful basis to name Mallory. I was afraid that pushing further without proof would make me look reckless. I chose the report I could defend, instead of the question I could not answer. "That choice protected your career," Colleen said. "Yes," I replied, "and it protected the facility." It did not matter that I had not fabricated evidence or hidden the original report. My signature still told the families the system had reached the end of what it could do. In reality, it had reached the end of what the people inside it were willing to risk. Janice did not answer my calls. 3 days later, Elise received a letter from an attorney representing her. The letter warned us not to contact Janice directly and suggested that reopening Silver Glen could expose everyone who participated in the original review, including me. It emphasized my signature, my title, and my approval of the corrective action plan. Then, in the final paragraph, it offered a meeting. Janice was willing to provide selected information about Mallory through counsel if the families agreed to limit public statements and avoid expanding the matter into a broader regulatory complaint. The proposal did not use the words silence or protection. It referred to efficient resolution, privacy interests, and avoiding unnecessary harm to current residents. I had read enough settlement language to recognize the bargain. Janice wanted to trade pieces of the truth for control over where the truth could go. Elise advised me not to respond emotionally. We asked Janice's attorney to put every proposed term in writing and identify what records existed, who controlled them, and whether they had been disclosed to regulators. We did not promise confidentiality. We did not threaten her. The fact that Janice had hired counsel and offered information told us she believed documents still existed that were more dangerous than my old signature. The strongest lead came from a different family. Their mother's credit card had been used in August 2020 for a purchase just under $400. The facility had reimbursed the amount, and the bank had resolved the charge dispute. Because the transaction had been formally disputed, the bank and retailer had retained more information than they normally would have kept after 5 years. The family's estate representative obtained the old dispute packet and gave it to Elise. The purchase had been shipped to a private mailbox in New Britain, not to Silver Glen or the resident's home. The fulfillment record listed the box number, but not the renter's name. Dana from 5 years earlier might have called the mailbox provider and asked for help. Dana, sitting in Elise's office, knew better. Private mailbox records included identification and signatures, and the company would not hand them to a stranger because she sounded convincing. Elise added the fulfillment record to the evidence packet already with the investigator. The investigator sought a subpoena for the mailbox provider's account records. We were told the company retained identification materials for 7 years under its internal compliance policy, which meant the old application might still exist. For 10 days, we heard nothing. Nathan sent 2 messages asking whether I intended to destroy every person connected to Mallory's former job. My mother left a voicemail saying the family was becoming a public spectacle. I answered neither of them. The next fact needed to come from a record, not another argument. Elise called me late on a Friday afternoon. The mailbox provider had produced the rental application, a copy of the identification used to open the account, and the signature card. The box had been active during the same month the resident's credit card was used. The name on the application was Mallory Keene. The mailbox record should have forced Mallory into silence. Instead, it made her louder. The following Monday, she posted a 12-minute video from what looked like a rented apartment, wearing no makeup and speaking in the careful, trembling voice people use when they want fear to sound more believable than facts. She admitted that she had hidden the bracelet at the wedding, but called it a panic response after months of feeling watched by me. She said I had searched through her past before she married Nathan, questioned every gap in her employment history, and treated her like a suspect long before there was any reason to do so. Then, she changed the origin of the bracelet again. It was no longer an heirloom from her grandmother. She called it a gift from an elderly woman who had loved her like family during her caregiving years. That was the third version in less than 2 weeks. First, the bracelet had belonged to her grandmother. Then she had implied it might have come from a resale shop. Now Helen had given it to her out of affection. Mallory never explained why a gift from Helen carried no letter, no witness, no family record, and no mention in the statement she signed with police. She did not explain why she had tried to place suspicion on me or Reese. She only repeated that I was controlling, jealous, and unable to accept that Nathan no longer needed my approval. The video worked on enough people to matter. The comments under Reese's footage began filling with questions about why I had investigated my future sister-in-law before the wedding. Several accounts said Mallory could have done something wrong and still been harassed by me. Someone sent a clipped section of her video to my employer, removing every reference to the bracelet and leaving only the accusation that a compliance director had used professional skills to stalk a family member. By lunchtime, our general counsel asked me to attend a formal ethics meeting. I brought Elise and every record of my activity. I showed that I had never accessed Silver Glen's system after leaving the company, never asked a former colleague to search Mallory, and never used my current employer's databases. The only background checking I had done came from public sources: state charity filings, old event programs, a professional networking profile, and archived pages that showed Mallory had described her previous work in 3 different ways. In one version, she had managed community outreach. In another, she had worked in resident engagement. In a third, she said she had left elder care before the period when Silver Glen employed her. The ethics panel did not accuse me of misconduct, but they asked whether I had disclosed the personal conflict early enough. I admitted I had not. I had treated my concern about Mallory as a private family problem until the wedding accusation connected it to my former work. I also acknowledged that checking public records without telling Nathan had been a poor decision relationally, even if it had not violated policy. The distinction mattered to me. I had not abused my authority, but I had still acted as if collecting information was easier than having an honest conversation. My employer placed no restriction on my position, though I voluntarily stepped away from any internal matter involving former Silver Glen personnel or related litigation. General counsel asked me to continue preserving my communications and to route all external requests through Elise. The outcome was reasonable, but it did not feel like a victory. Mallory had managed to force me to defend my professional integrity, while she still had not explained why Helen Price's bracelet had been hidden in a photography case. Nathan confronted me that evening in the parking lot outside Elise's office. He had waited beside my car rather than asking for an appointment, which told me he wanted an emotional answer before I had time to prepare a careful one. He held printed pages from the public searches I had conducted and asked how long I had been investigating Mallory. I told him I began looking after. She gave conflicting accounts of where she had worked and why she had left elder care. "You could have asked me," he said. "I did ask you. You told me she didn't like talking about the past. That should have been enough. It would have been enough if her past had not appeared on her wrist at your wedding." Nathan flinched, but he did not step back. He said that did not excuse treating him like a child incapable of choosing his own wife. I wanted to tell him that his choice had led to police emptying my purse, but that would have avoided the part of his accusation that was true. I had not trusted him to hear my concern without defending Mallory, so I had gathered information quietly and waited for certainty. I had treated our relationship like a case in which facts would eventually overcome resistance. "I should have told you what I was checking," I said. "I thought you would shut me out before I had enough to explain why I was worried. You decided my reaction before I had it." "Yes, that was wrong." Nathan looked almost relieved until I continued. "But being wrong about how I handled it does not make the records false. It does not put Helen's bracelet back in her room, and it does not explain the mailbox." He accused me of always needing the last word. I told him I did not need the last word. I needed him to stop using my flaws as evidence that Mallory's actions did not matter. We ended the conversation without raising our voices. That was progress only in the narrowest sense. He walked away knowing I had admitted a mistake, but he was still looking for a version of events in which my mistake and Mallory's crimes canceled each other out. Colleen became less certain after Mallory's video spread. One of Helen's grandchildren saw strangers discussing the family online and asked Colleen to remove the photographs. The family did not want Helen's cognitive decline turned into entertainment, and they did not trust people who had ignored the first video to handle her story responsibly now. Colleen called me from Elise's office and asked whether I intended to release the old reports to defend myself. I told her no. The photographs, receipts, and family records belonged to Helen's estate, not to my reputation. We would use them through attorneys, investigators, and the proper proceedings, unless the family chose otherwise. If they decided to withdraw from public involvement entirely, I would respect that. The wedding footage had already cleared me. I did not need to turn Helen into proof that I had always been right. Colleen was quiet for several seconds before saying she would continue cooperating privately. She wanted the bracelet returned and her mother's record corrected, but she did not want Helen reduced to the confused old lady Mallory stole from. I promised her that every statement we prepared would identify Helen as the owner of the bracelet and a person whose repeated questions had been dismissed, not as a convenient victim in my family drama. Janice's attorney sent a settlement proposal the next morning. It offered a limited compensation fund for 3 named families, cooperation concerning Mallory's employment, and a confidential correction to certain Silver Glen records. In return, the families would agree not to expand the complaint beyond the known incidents, not to seek broader regulatory review, and not to discuss Janice's reporting decisions publicly. Rose's personnel file was not mentioned. Neither were the omitted complaint logs or the possibility that other residents had never learned their losses were connected. The proposal was written to sound practical. It emphasized current residents, financial stability, privacy, and the dangers of disrupting care. 5 years earlier, I might have read it as a responsible compromise. This time, I saw the shape underneath the language. Janice was willing to acknowledge only the victims whose evidence had already surfaced, and only if everyone agreed not to look for the ones still hidden. Elise told Janice's attorney, "We would review the terms but would not enter confidentiality discussions, while regulators and investigators were gathering evidence. We did not reject the proposal with a dramatic speech. We simply refused to let access to records become payment for silence." Janice's lawyer responded that my own role in the original report would become relevant if the matter widened. I told Elise to answer that I was prepared to explain my signature under oath. That afternoon, my mother called about Nathan. She said he had stopped sleeping and that Mallory was blaming me for destroying the marriage before it had begun. I reminded her that Mallory had signed a false accusation against me and hidden stolen property. Linda said she knew that was wrong, but she also knew Mallory had been frightened by the way I questioned people. It was the same balancing act she had used all my life. One person committed the harm, and I became responsible for making the harm easier to discuss. Then Linda said something that changed the conversation. She told me Mallory had been helping her with online banking for months and had prepared paperwork for a small senior companionship business they planned to launch after the honeymoon. According to Linda, Mallory had offered to manage scheduling and hiring, while Linda used her excellent credit to guarantee a business line. My mother said this as evidence that Mallory cared about her future. I stopped arguing about Nathan and asked whether Mallory knew her password. Linda said Mallory had set up the banking app because the verification codes confused her. I asked whose phone number received recovery messages. She hesitated, then admitted Mallory had changed it to make things more convenient. When I asked whether any loan documents had been signed, Linda said no, but some forms had been prepared. I did not order her to give me the phone or accuse her of being foolish. I asked whether she would call the bank with me and let an employee explain what access Mallory had. Linda resisted at first, saying I was turning kindness into another investigation. I told her she could keep every opinion she had about me, but she needed to know who could enter her accounts. After a long silence, she agreed. The bank representative confirmed that Mallory's number had been listed for account recovery and that a device Linda did not recognize had been marked as trusted. Linda authorized the bank to remove the device, replace the recovery number, and reset every credential. Before ending the call, the representative gave us the exact timestamp when Mallory's access was revoked and explained that any later login from that device would be recorded as unauthorized. My mother stared at the dark screen after the call ended. She still wanted to believe Mallory had only been helping. I wanted to believe changing the passwords had ended the danger. Neither of us understood yet that Mallory would try to enter the account again the following morning. The fraud alert arrived at 8:17 the next morning, less than 14 hours after my mother had removed Mallory's access. Linda called me before I had finished reading the notification. Her voice was thin and breathless, and for a moment I thought the transfer had already gone through. I asked her to read the message exactly as it appeared. Someone had attempted to log in from the device the bank had removed the previous evening, then initiated a transfer of $7,500 to a business account. The bank system had frozen the transaction because the device was no longer trusted and the amount was unusual for Linda's account. I told my mother not to call Mallory and not to touch anything in the app until we spoke with the fraud department. Linda kept saying it had to be a mistake. Mallory knew the old password, but perhaps the app had opened automatically. Perhaps she had been trying to pay a bill they had discussed. Perhaps the business account belonged to a vendor. Each explanation became quieter than the one before it. I did not tell her she had been foolish. Shame would only make her defend Mallory longer. I reminded her that the important fact was simple. The bank had recorded a login after permission was formally withdrawn. The same representative who had helped us the night before joined the call with a fraud investigator. Linda verified her identity and confirmed she had not authorized the login or transfer. The investigator read back the beneficiary account name. It belonged to a limited liability company Mallory had registered 3 months earlier for the senior companionship business she planned to launch after the honeymoon. The device identifier matched the phone Mallory had previously used to manage Linda's account. The IP address came from the apartment where Mallory had been staying since leaving the hotel. The bank locked online transfers, preserved the login records, and opened a formal fraud case. Linda signed an electronic affidavit, stating that Mallory's authority had ended the previous evening and that the transfer had not been approved. Because the money had been frozen before leaving the account, my mother had not lost $7,500. For the first time since the wedding, I had stopped Mallory before the damage became another document explaining why no one could be held responsible. Linda sat at my dining table while we completed the security steps. She looked smaller than she had the night before, but anger had begun replacing denial. She asked why Mallory would risk everything for an amount that would not even fund the business for long. I told her I did not think the transfer was only about the money. It was a test of whether the access still worked and whether Linda would question it. If the bank had approved the transfer and my mother had accepted an explanation, the next request could have been larger. She called me every night, Linda said. She remembered what time I took my blood pressure pills. She asked about my garden. You send me links and lists. The comparison hurt because it was not entirely unfair. When my father died, I had become efficient before I learned how to grieve. I handled insurance forms, repairs, taxes, and appointments because practical problems had answers. Over time, I had begun offering solutions when my mother wanted company and asking questions when Nathan wanted reassurance. Mallory had studied that distance and stepped into it with warmth. I know I can sound like a checklist, I said. I should have called more, instead of assuming fixing things was the same as being close to you. But kindness does not give someone the right to use your account after you said no. Linda nodded without looking at me. She asked whether the police would arrest Mallory that day. I said the bank would preserve the evidence and make any required report, but an investigation would take time. The transfer, device logs, IP address, beneficiary account, and revocation timestamp were strong because they existed independently of our family's opinions. No one needed to believe my tone or Mallory's tears. The records showed when access ended and what happened afterward. My mother canceled the unfinished application for the business line and notified the lender that she would not guarantee any debt connected to Mallory's company. The application had never been completed, so it was not the basis of the fraud case. It did, however, reveal how far Mallory had planned ahead. She had drafted a $40,000 credit line with Linda listed as guarantor and had entered estimates based on my mother's pension, home equity, and credit score. Beside one incomplete section, Mallory had written a note reminding Linda not to discuss the application with me because I would turn it into an investigation. By noon, Nathan had received a summary from the bank through Linda's attorney. He called Mallory before speaking with me. I was not present for that conversation, and I learned what had been said only later, when Nathan provided their text exchange to Elise. Mallory claimed the transfer had been a bookkeeping error. She said Linda had promised to contribute seed money and had forgotten. When Nathan reminded her that Linda had revoked access the night before, Mallory changed direction and accused me of frightening my mother into denying an agreement. Her messages used the same phrases Nathan had used about me for years. I was controlling. I could not let him grow up. I treated everyone like a suspect. I destroyed good things because I needed to be right. Mallory had not invented those ideas. Nathan had given them to her during private conversations about our family, and she had turned them into a map showing where to apply pressure. She knew my mother would resist anything that sounded like an order from me. She knew Nathan would defend any choice that made him feel independent. She had not needed to isolate me physically. She only needed to make my warnings sound like proof of my worst traits. Nathan came to my apartment that evening with printed copies of the bank summary and Mallory's texts. He looked older than he had a week earlier. He said he finally understood that she had used his resentment against me, then waited for me to comfort him. I did not. Realizing he had been manipulated did not erase the choices he had made before the manipulation became obvious. He asked whether we could keep the banking incident separate from Silver Glen. His divorce attorney believed the attempted transfer and wedding footage would support a quick settlement. Nathan wanted to give Mallory a chance to leave quietly, return the bracelet, and avoid dragging our mother through public proceedings. He said Linda had already suffered enough. Rosa lost her job, I said. Helen spent the end of her life being told she had forgotten her own bracelet. Other families were paid just enough to stop asking questions. Keeping this quiet would protect us, not them. Nathan said those cases were 5 years old and difficult to prove. I agreed. I also told him difficult was not the same as irrelevant. The bank records showed Mallory had not changed. The wedding showed she still chose a vulnerable target, created a believable accusation, and expected the people around her to finish the punishment. Silver Glen was not a separate story. It was where she learned the method. He asked what I wanted from him. I told him to correct the public accusation against me, cooperate with investigators, and stop asking me to carry the moral cost of decisions that made his life easier. I would not manage his divorce, negotiate his refunds, or tell our relatives how to speak about Mallory. Those responsibilities belonged to him. After he left, Elise called with the result of the subpoena to the private mailbox company. The account had been opened under the name Mallory Keene, using the same identification number found in her Silver Glen personnel file. The signature card matched her employment documents, and the account had been active when a resident's credit card was used for the disputed purchase. The retailer's fulfillment record showed that the item had been delivered to that box and collected 2 days later. One transaction did not prove Mallory had taken every missing object at Silver Glen. It proved something narrower and stronger. A purchase made with a resident's card had been delivered to a mailbox controlled by Mallory. Combined with Helen's bracelet, the wedding footage, and the attempted transfer from Linda, the pattern no longer depended on memory alone. Elise then forwarded an audio file Janice's attorney had given the investigator. It was a voicemail Mallory had left after learning Janice might cooperate. I pressed play and heard Mallory say that the families had abandoned their parents, while she had fed them, bathed them, and listened when no one else came. Then she mentioned Helen by name. She wanted me to have that bracelet, Mallory said. Even if she forgot saying it later, I knew what she meant. The voicemail did not contain the words, "I stole it," but it told me more about Mallory than a clean confession ever could. She believed care created ownership. She had decided that because she spent more time with Helen than Helen's family did, she could interpret what Helen really meant, even after Helen repeatedly asked where her bracelet had gone. In Mallory's mind, memory loss did not make Helen vulnerable. It made her consent easier to rewrite. Elise warned me not to circulate the recording. Mallory had left it voluntarily on Janice's voicemail, and Janice's attorney had transferred it to the investigator through proper channels. It still needed authentication, context, and comparison with the other evidence. I listened twice, wrote down the exact wording, and closed the file. The strength of the case would come from independent records supporting one another, not from turning a private voicemail into another viral clip. Rosa agreed to meet us in person the following week. She brought her own attorney and a folder containing rejection emails from care facilities that had contacted Silver Glen after her termination. One employer had withdrawn an offer after being told she was not eligible for rehire due to a resident property concern. The phrase had followed her even though no property had ever been found in her possession and no police report had named her as a suspect. Rosa described the day Helen's bracelet disappeared. Mallory had helped Helen dress that morning. Rosa changed the linens after lunch. By evening, Colleen had arrived and asked about the bracelet. Mallory suggested Helen might have given it away during a confused episode, then mentioned that housekeeping had entered the room. She never directly accused Rosa. She created a path and waited for management to walk down it. When they questioned me, they already knew what answer they wanted, Rosa said. They asked why I was nervous. I was nervous because 3 managers were sitting across from me talking about police. I told her that my objection to her suspension had remained buried in an internal review no future employer would ever see. I apologized for accepting a final report that left her exposed. Rosa did not forgive me on command. She said she would provide a sworn statement because she wanted her personnel record corrected, and because she did not want another low-wage employee blamed the next time something disappeared. That was enough. Janice's records arrived through her attorney 2 days later. They did not come to me in a cardboard box or appear mysteriously on my doorstep. Her counsel produced them to the investigator and regulator under an agreement, preserving Janice's right to argue about her own liability. Elise received authenticated excerpts relevant to the families she represented. The records included complaint logs that had never been attached to the external report, shift schedules, drafts of supplemental notices, and emails discussing whether gifts from residents had to be documented. In one message, Mallory asked Janice whether an employee needed to report jewelry given by a resident when no family was involved. Janice answered that all gifts had to be reported and approved, regardless of family involvement. Mallory replied that she was asking only because residents sometimes became attached to caregivers. The email did not prove Helen gave Mallory anything. It proved Mallory had asked how to keep a resident's jewelry without creating a record. The most damaging documents concerned what Janice had chosen not to send outside Silver Glen. A draft supplemental report listed 3 additional losses and noted that Mallory had worked in or near each affected area. Janice had crossed out the sentence linking the incidents and replaced it with, "No reliable common factor has been identified." The final supplement was never submitted. Janice's attorney argued that she had been following corporate counsel's advice and protecting residents from a disruptive investigation without direct evidence. Then he renewed the settlement proposal. Silver Glen would fund confidential payments to 3 families, correct limited records, and cooperate concerning the bracelet. In exchange, the families would not seek a broader regulatory finding, discuss omitted complaints publicly, or support additional claims. Rosa's record was still not included. Neither was an admission that the losses formed a pattern. The agreement would compensate the people whose files had become dangerous while leaving every unnamed resident exactly where they had been before. 5 years earlier, I might have described that offer as practical. This time, I told Elise to reject it. We did not threaten Janice or demand a public spectacle. We answered that no settlement could prevent the families from cooperating with regulators or restrict Rosa from correcting a false employment history. If Silver Glen wanted to discuss compensation, it could do so without purchasing silence. Janice responded by trying to place the entire failure on Mallory. Her attorney produced more records showing Mallory's access to residents and her inconsistent explanations after complaints. Mallory learned what Janice had provided and retaliated within 48 hours. Through her own lawyer, Mallory turned over emails showing Janice had changed suspected theft to unverified loss, instructed staff to contact management before calling police about resident property, and negotiated Mallory's quiet resignation with a confidentiality clause. Mallory claimed those emails proved Janice and Silver Glen had used her as a scapegoat to avoid a licensing review. The emails did prove Janice had concealed the seriousness of the pattern. They also proved Mallory knew exactly what she had been suspected of when she left. Her defense had shifted again. She could no longer claim there had never been allegations, or that Dana had invented the Silver Glen connection after the wedding. Janice and Mallory were trying to survive by proving the other woman had done something worse. Each document they released filled a gap in the case against both of them. Elise and I met with the investigator to organize what could actually be verified. We placed every item on a timeline. Mallory signed a police statement, accusing me after she had hidden the bracelet herself. Venue footage showed her approach my purse and redirect toward the hard case. Nathan's microphone captured her naming the inside zipper. The engraving, photographs, purchase, receipt, and repair record identified the bracelet as Helen's. The merchant fulfillment record and private mailbox file linked Mallory to a purchase made with a residence card. Linda's bank records showed Mallory attempted a transfer after her access was revoked. Janice's files established that the pattern had existed and had been narrowed before outside review. Mallory's own emails and voicemail revealed that she knew residents' gifts required reporting and believed care entitled her to decide what they wanted. No single piece proved every allegation. Together, they made coincidence increasingly impossible. That evening, Mallory's attorney contacted Elise with a request for a private resolution meeting. Mallory was willing to explain what had happened at Silver Glen, return anything still in her possession, leave Connecticut, and agree never to work with older adults again. In return, she wanted me to stop supporting the broader regulatory review and keep Nathan's name out of any public filing. She asked to meet without Colleen, Rosa, or the investigator. She said this was a family matter between two women who had both made mistakes. I refused those conditions. Through Elise, I agreed to meet only if both attorneys attended, every person consented to recording, and no promise of confidentiality was made in advance. Mallory accepted after several hours, then sent one final message. She said that if I insisted on making everything public, Nathan would go down with her. The meeting took place in Elise's conference room 4 days later. Mallory arrived with her attorney and sat across from me, wearing a gray suit and no wedding ring. Before anyone spoke about Silver Glen, Elise placed a recorder in the center of the table and stated the date, location, and names of everyone present. She explained that the meeting would be recorded and could be shared with investigators, regulators, and counsel representing the affected families. Mallory's attorney confirmed his consent. Mallory hesitated, then said she understood and agreed. She looked thinner than she had at the wedding, but the softness in her voice remained carefully controlled. She said she wanted to explain what the footage could not show. According to her, she had not entered the reception planning to accuse me. When I mentioned the floral clasp in the bridal suite, she became afraid that I would recognize the bracelet and destroy her marriage before she could tell Nathan her version of the past. She admitted removing the bracelet in the hallway, walking toward my purse, and hiding it in the photography case when the purse was moved. I panicked, she said. I saw you looking at it, and I knew what you would do. What did you think I would do? I asked. You would investigate me. You would decide who I was before I could explain. Mallory admitted signing the statement accusing me, but she refused to call it a planned frame-up. She said she had convinced herself that I might find the bracelet where she had hidden it, take it, and use it against her. When Elise asked why Mallory had directed the officer to the inside zipper of my purse, she said she no longer remembered exactly what she had been thinking. Her attorney interrupted before she could offer another version. I did not ask her to confess to every loss at Silver Glen. I asked about Helen. Mallory looked down at her hands and said Helen had loved her. She described feeding her on difficult mornings, washing her hair, sitting with her when she woke frightened at night, and listening to the same stories again and again. She said Colleen visited, but not often enough to understand the bond they had shared. Helen wanted me to have something of hers, Mallory said. She told me that. Did she say the bracelet? Elise asked. She showed it to me. She said I deserved something beautiful. Was anyone else present? No. Did you report the gift? Mallory's mouth tightened. She said Silver Glen's rules had been written by people who did not understand how deeply residents could care for staff. Helen's memory changed from day to day, and Mallory believed making her sign a gift form would have humiliated her. I asked why Helen had continued asking where the bracelet was if she had given it away. Mallory leaned toward me. Because she forgot. That doesn't mean she didn't mean it when she said it. There it was again, the belief beneath every explanation. Helen's memory counted when it benefited Mallory, and disappeared when it did not. Mallory had appointed herself the final authority on what another woman intended. She began talking about Silver Glen as if the facility had been divided between devoted caregivers and selfish families. She said staff earned barely enough to live, while residents wore jewelry worth more than a year's salary. Their children appeared for holidays, complained about small mistakes, and left again. Mallory had been the one cleaning bodies, changing sheets, and sitting through fear and confusion. I told her none of that was an answer to the merchant record, the private mailbox, or the purchase made with a resident's card. She said the card transaction had been a misunderstanding involving an item a resident had asked her to order. When Elise asked why the order went to a private mailbox in Mallory's name, she said packages frequently disappeared from employee housing. She had an explanation for every individual fact. The problem was that each explanation required us to ignore all the others. Mallory's attorney redirected the conversation toward a proposed resolution. Mallory would return any remaining property that investigators could identify, except financial restitution, leave Connecticut, and sign an agreement never to work with older adults or vulnerable clients again. She would also cooperate with Nathan's divorce and waive claims to most of the wedding gifts and honeymoon refunds. In exchange, I would stop assisting the broader Silver Glen review, the families would limit their civil claims, and no one would seek public findings against Mallory beyond the wedding incident. I asked whether Rosa's personnel record would be corrected. Her attorney said Rosa's employment was a matter between her and Silver Glen. I asked whether all affected families would be notified. He said they could discuss the 3 families with documented losses. I asked whether Mallory would acknowledge attempting to transfer money from Linda's account after access had been revoked. Mallory said my mother had promised to invest in the business and had changed her story under pressure. Nothing had changed. Mallory was willing to accept consequences only if she could choose which victims counted and which facts remained private. She looked directly at me. "You're acting as if you're better than me, but your name is on that report. You saw what happened and signed it away. If I'm guilty, then so are you." For 5 years, that sentence had been waiting for me. Janice had implied it. Nathan had feared it. I had used softer versions of it against myself. "My signature is on the report," I said. I did not steal from Helen. I did not use a resident's credit card. I did not accuse an innocent employee or hide evidence. I also did not stop the external report from being filed. But I saw enough to know the resolution protected Silver Glen more than it protected the residents, and I accepted it because it was defensible and safe for my career. That was my failure. Mallory stared at me, waiting for shame to make me retreat. "I will say that under oath," I continued. "I will say it to the regulator, my employer, Rosa, and every family who asks. You cannot use something I am willing to admit to buy my silence." Her expression changed then. The frightened bride disappeared, and the anger beneath her composure surfaced. She said I was destroying Nathan to prove a point. She claimed he had repeated private complaints about me because he had spent his entire life suffocating under my judgment. If the investigation widened, she said his name would appear in messages, financial records, and every article about the case. Nathan had given her information about our family. He had enabled her at the wedding and asked me to leave. But there was no evidence that he knew about Silver Glen, the bracelet, or the attempted transfer before they happened. Mallory was threatening him because she knew hurting him was still the easiest way to make me hesitate. The meeting ended without an agreement. Mallory and her attorney left first. Elise stopped the recorder, sealed the original file, and prepared copies for the investigator. I sat in the same chair for several minutes, not because I regretted what I had said, but because saying it aloud had removed the last place I could hide from my own part in the past. Nathan came to see me that evening. He had learned that the meeting failed, though he did not know every detail. He asked me to keep Linda's name out of public filings and let his divorce attorney handle the current evidence. He said our mother would never recover from being described as another elderly woman Mallory tried to exploit. He worried about his job, our relatives, and the possibility that every search of his name would lead back to his wedding. I told him we could request appropriate privacy protections for Linda, but we could not erase what happened. He asked whether humiliating the family would bring Helen's bracelet back or restore Rosa's career. "No," I said, "but hiding it would protect the same people it protected last time." He reminded me that he had canceled the honeymoon and filed for divorce. I told him ending his marriage was not an apology to me. He had watched my purse come up empty and still chosen the person accusing me because asking me to leave had been easier than confronting his bride. Filing papers did not erase that decision. Nathan asked whether I planned to punish him forever. I said I did not want to punish him at all. I wanted him to correct his public statement, cooperate honestly, and stop asking me to absorb consequences so he could feel forgiven sooner. He left without arguing, but he did not ask me to stop again. The following morning, Elise submitted the numbered evidence packet to the investigator, prosecutor, regulator, and attorneys representing the families. It included the wedding footage excerpt, videographer audio, Mallory's signed police statement, the bracelet identification, merchant and mailbox records, Linda's bank logs, Janice's files, Mallory's emails, Rosa's statement, and the recorded meeting. Each item had its own source and chain of custody note. The case no longer depended on anyone trusting my instincts. I sent a formal disclosure to my employer that same day. The ethics review found no evidence that I had accessed restricted records or abused my position, but the company removed me temporarily from an advisory committee involving reporting standards while the Silver Glen matter remained active. General counsel warned that my admission about the old report could affect future leadership opportunities, even if it did not violate current policy. For the first time, telling the truth was costing me something I could not recover with a corrected document. I accepted the restriction and signed the acknowledgement. A week later, the regulatory office sent me a notice to appear and testify about the original Silver Glen review. I read it twice, then opened the drawer where I kept the black fountain pen I had used throughout the year I worked on that case. 5 years earlier, I had used that pen to sign a report that allowed everyone to move on without answering the hardest questions. The next morning, I placed it in my purse and walked into the hearing knowing exactly what I would never sign again. The hearing did not begin with a dramatic confession. It began with documents, dates, and names that should have been placed beside one another 5 years earlier. I testified about the review I conducted in 2020, the external report Janice had narrowed to a single unverified loss, and the complaints that were never added afterward. I explained what I knew, what I did not know, and where I had failed. I did not say Silver Glen ordered me to lie, because it had not. I said something harder. The final report had been technically defensible, and I had accepted that standard even though I understood it protected the facility more than the residents. Colleen spoke after me. She did not describe Helen only through memory loss or stolen property. She talked about a woman who taught elementary school for 31 years, saved handwritten birthday cards, and refused to replace a darker gold link because she liked the reminder that beautiful things could survive damage. Rosa described losing her job without evidence and carrying Silver Glen's suspicion into every interview that followed. Their testimony made it impossible to reduce the case to my family's ruined wedding. Janice appeared through her attorney and tried to separate herself from Mallory. She confirmed that Mallory had access to the affected residence and that concerns had existed before her resignation. Mallory's attorney responded with Janice's own emails changing suspected theft to unverified loss, delaying supplemental reports, and directing staff to contact management before police. Each woman tried to prove the other had been more responsible. In doing so, they filled the gaps that had protected both of them. The criminal investigation focused on what could be established cleanly, not every item that had ever disappeared at Silver Glen. Mallory's signed statement showed she had formally accused me after hiding the bracelet herself. The hallway footage and Nathan's microphone established how she had tried to direct the search. The bank records showed she logged into my mother's account after permission had been revoked and attempted to transfer money into her own business account. The merchant and mailbox records connected her to one older, unauthorized purchase. The bracelet tied her directly to Helen. By early summer, Mallory accepted a plea agreement. She admitted making a false accusation to police, attempting the unauthorized transfer, and committing related financial offenses supported by the records. The older Silver Glen incidents remained part of the restitution and civil claims, but prosecutors did not pretend every 5-year-old loss could be charged. Mallory received a limited period of incarceration, followed by supervised probation. She was ordered to pay restitution, faced separate civil judgments, and was barred from working with older adults or other vulnerable clients. The sentence was not as cinematic as Strangers Online had demanded. There was no judge delivering a speech about karma, no crowd applauding when Mallory was led away. The satisfaction came from something quieter. She could no longer describe the wedding as panic, Helen's bracelet as a misunderstanding, or my mother's money as an informal investment. Those explanations had finally been replaced by findings she did not control. Janice did not escape by cooperating. The regulatory review found that she had failed to supplement the original report, concealed the significance of repeated complaints, and allowed an unsupported suspicion against Rosa to remain in her employment file. She lost her authority to manage a licensed care facility and was required to testify in the civil proceedings. Silver Glen agreed to independent monitoring, a new reporting process, outside audits, and compensation discussions with affected families. The facility remained open because forcing current residents to move would have punished the wrong people. Rosa received a corrected personnel record stating that no evidence had established she took resident property. Silver Glen sent a written apology and reached a settlement with her. She told me the money mattered, but the corrected record mattered more. For years, one sentence in a file had allowed strangers to treat suspicion as fact. Now, another sentence finally removed it. Not every civil claim was finished when I began telling this story. Some families were still negotiating. Others were deciding whether reopening old records would bring relief or only more pain. The difference was that they were finally making those choices with access to the information Janice had once kept separate. Nathan filed for divorce the month after the wedding. He and Mallory had no children, no house together, and little property beyond wedding gifts, a recently opened joint account, travel refunds, and bills from a marriage that had barely begun. Even so, the process took months. The divorce became final at the end of May, not 3 days after he canceled the honeymoon. Nathan posted a public correction before the final hearing. He stated that my purse had been empty, that Mallory had hidden the bracelet herself, and that he had been wrong to ask me to leave the reception. He did not ask people to forgive him, and for once, he did not describe his decision as something forced on him by two difficult women. My mother's apology came later. At first, Linda said she was sorry that everything had become so painful. I told her pain was not an action. She went quiet, then tried again. She said she was sorry she had asked me to apologize after I was falsely accused. She was sorry she had treated Mallory's tears as more trustworthy than the empty purse in front of her. She admitted that for years, she had expected me to handle problems while resenting me for sounding like the person in charge. I accepted the apology without pretending it erased the pattern. We began speaking more honestly after that. I called her without a checklist sometimes. She learned that caring for someone did not mean surrendering judgment to whoever made her feel least alone. Nathan asked whether we could return to the relationship we had before Mallory. I told him I did not want that relationship back. Before Mallory, I had been the person he called when money, paperwork, or family conflict became difficult. He had relied on my judgment in private and resented it in public. I loved him, but I would not resume a role in which I cleaned up consequences while he kept the right to doubt me whenever loyalty became inconvenient. I ended the marriage, he said. Ending your marriage protected you, I replied. Rebuilding trust with me will require more than leaving her. I did not cut him out of my life. I stopped making reconciliation easy. He would have to show consistency, not desperation. He would have to call me when there was nothing to fix, and defend me when doing so cost him something. The bracelet remained in evidence until the criminal case ended. When it was finally released, the officer returned it to Colleen through her attorney. I was present when she opened the evidence box, but I did not touch it. The diamonds looked smaller than they had beneath the wedding lights. The darker replacement link was still visible beside the tulip clasp, and the initials HP remained inside. Colleen placed the bracelet in Helen's memory box beside the repair receipt, family photographs, and one of the birthday cards Helen had saved. It was not a trophy from my victory. It was something that had belonged to a woman who spent years being told she had misplaced her own truth. The final corrected Silver Glen report arrived the following month. It acknowledged the pattern of exploitation, the omitted complaints, the unsupported action against Rosa, and the failures in escalation. My original signature remained in the historical file. I had asked them not to remove it. Erasing my name would have repeated the same mistake in a more flattering direction. The first report carried my signature beneath a conclusion that helped everyone move on without answering the hardest questions. The corrected report carried my testimony beside the names of the women no one had believed. I could not change what I had signed 5 years earlier. But this time, no one was allowed to say they had simply forgotten. When someone accuses you, stay calm, preserve evidence, Document every detail and refuse to accept blame just to keep peace. Trust should follow actions, not tears or appearances. Admit your own mistakes, correct them, and protect others from repeated harm. Subscribe for more stories about truth, boundaries, accountability, and courage.